Packing the right gear for a trip is one thing, but double checking that everything works properly is often a step that gets overlooked. And if certain gear fails mid-trip, you could find yourself in a situation that is uncomfortable at best or deadly at worst. Here's my pre-hike checklist that I follow to make sure all systems are go before I even leave my house for a backpacking trip.
Gear up and get outside.
In case you're wondering, this is not a packing list or an essential gear list for a trip. This is more of an action or a to-do list that you might want to think about before you even go off-grid for a backcountry trip. I like to prioritize my pre-hike checklist based on the things that are most likely to get me into a risky situation. I can't remember what this was called, but there was a thing I learned in Boy Scouts back in the day where there's an order of priority of things you should assess, risks you should assess when you're in a survival situation. And the first thing is first aid. You got to make sure everybody's breathing and nobody's bleeding and everybody's okay. The next thing is shelter. Then you want to move on to water and food and so on down the line. So let's start with first aid. So I realize that my first aid kit that I take on a backpacking trip might be a lot more than what some other guys do. I'm not here to say what's right or what's wrong. I'm not a professional in that respect, but I would say just make sure you've got some emergency essentials that are going to take care of things. My first aid kit also includes a few extra emergency supplies, some bandages and something to clean with, whether that's alcohol pads or some ointment. I like to carry moleskin blister pads. That's something I use regularly. I also keep some painkillers in here, and then I usually also keep some Benadryl or maybe some things to address any kind of stings or allergic reactions. Now on different types of trips, like if I'm hunting or if I'm riding motorcycles in the backcountry, trail riding, I'll also take like a trauma kit like this, just a little extra security for me when I'm doing things like using motorized vehicles or firearms. But the basics should include stuff to clean and bandage wounds, as well as stuff to deal with pain and allergic reactions. And there are plenty of other good videos by people who know more about that stuff than me out there on YouTube if you want to go check some of those out. That brings us to shelter. I've got a tent here. The things I like to check before I leave are number one, that I know how to set it up. If it's a new tent to you, you should always try to set that up in your backyard or wherever, just so you know what you're doing before you get out there. One other thing I will do before I leave, I like to open it up and double check that my stakes are in there and that my poles are in there if there are any. And then I know I need my trekking poles for this tent. If you forget your stakes, especially with a non-freestanding tent, you're in trouble. The other thing I like to do, especially if I know I haven't used a certain tent for a while, is make sure there are no holes or tears or problems with it. I just want to know that it's going to go well when I set it up out there. More often than not, I take a Tyvek ground sheet. You might have a specific footprint for your tent, and that's great too. And sometimes I might leave that at home just to save the weight if I know it's not going to be a problem. Things like rain flies and ground sheets may be optional in some cases. That's up to you. But if you know you need it, make sure you've got it. Water comes next on my list of priorities, and so I always want to double check my water filter. I just want to make sure it's clean if I'm using one of these fiber filters like this. So I'm going to want to back flush it with clean water. The other thing to consider is, has it been frozen? I am currently in the situation with this very filter. I stored this in my garage over the winter, and in my garage, has it frozen? Probably, maybe. When these kind of fiber-based filters freeze, it can break down the filter itself. It can open up some of those cells in there, which means that it won't trap or stop or block all the bacteria and other particles that might be harmful to you from getting through into your drinking water. So you definitely don't want to use a compromised filter. But how can you know if it's compromised or not? You really can't. Even Sawyer says that. I've read things about how you can put red food coloring through it. Apparently that's bogus. I've read things about how you can just look and see if it flows water extra fast, but that's really subjective and hard to tell. So it's kind of one of those deals where when in doubt, throw it out. And that kills me to do that, but I am not 100% sure that this hasn't frozen. So what I'm gonna have to do is just replace this with a new one to make sure that my family and I are drinking clean water. It's only a problem after it has been wetted. After you've run water through that filter at any time, because you're never gonna get it completely dry in there, that is when you're going to need to replace it if it has frozen. But if it has never been used and it's sat in your frozen garage all winter, then you're fine. That brings me to my next point about water, which is making sure that I have a second way to purify it. Now you could just plan on boiling water as a backup, and that's totally fine. I also have a little pack of these tablets. These are just aqua tabs. For this, you just drop one little tablet into 2 quarts of water. You let it sit in there for 30 minutes, and then you can drink it. Now, if you do plan on boiling water as your backup, you need to make sure you have a stove that works to do so. You also are going to need a stove, most likely, to cook some food. Now, I like to double check that the backpacking stove I will be taking on that trip functions properly with the very fuel canister I will be taking and using as well. I have had these not work on me before, or sometimes you feel like there's fuel in there, but it's actually almost empty. I want to know that before I leave so that I'm prepared and I don't find myself out there with no way to warm water. So I will take my stove, put it on the canister, visual check whatever, take the lighter I plan on using, and light it up. I'm not going to run it for a long time, but I'm going to open it all the way up and then just shut it down. Look and listen if anything weird is happening. So far that looks good, so I'm happy to take this one with me on my trip. I'm not going to waste a bunch of fuel in some crazy boiling test or anything like that, but I just want to make sure there's no leaks, that there's fuel in there, and that the stove is working how I expect. I also want to double check that I have at least 2 ways to light it. Now I know that's the Boy Scout in me and a lot of you won't bother with that extra step, but I like to have this flint and steel and a lighter. The next item on my checklist regarding food is knowing how you're going to store your food. And this is especially applicable to those areas where bears coexist with recreationists. So if you're going to be camping or hiking in an area that requires an IGBC certified bear resistant container, you may need something like an Ursack, or it may be a bear canister. Last summer when I went on a trip in the Wind River Range in Wyoming, I knew I needed to have a bear resistant container, so I took this. I even watched a couple videos in advance. There's a great one from Justin Outdoors, you could check that out. But I hadn't used a figure 8 knot before that, so I was trying to figure it out. Well, I figured it out at home. I did it a couple times, but I didn't practice that all that much, and I didn't practice it around a tree limb. So when I got to my campsite that first night, I went to go put my bear bag up, and I couldn't for the life of me remember how to do that figure 8 knot. I couldn't get it just right. I did something, it was a stronger knot than it needed to be, but it was also hard to get undone, which is the nice thing about the figure 8 knot, is it's easy to loose. So I could tell you, just make sure you know how you're going to place your bear bag or your food storage when you're out in the field. The same goes if you're going to do a bear hang. I strongly encourage you to practice that at home so that you can do it quickly, because there's nothing more frustrating than when it's nightfall, you're tired and you want to go to bed, and you've got to go stomp around the woods, find a place to do it, and then get it hung. That's something that could turn into a multi-hour ordeal if you're not well prepared. So make sure you know how to store your food. I want to make sure that my sleeping pad inflates properly and holds air. A pad like this that's been stored for several months, you may find that it has a small leak somewhere. Usually you can fix those, but if you don't have the stuff to fix them in the field, you're going to be really frustrated, especially if you're just trying to settle down and go straight to bed. So I like to check that before I go. I'm going to unroll my sleeping pad. In my case, just to save some time, I'm going to use a little mini power pump. I'm going to blow it, inflate it, and I'm just going to let it sit there for several minutes and see if it's holding air as I expect. Luckily, a sleeping pad going flat is not a life or death situation, but it can be uncomfortable, and that can put a damper on your trip. These last few items on my checklist have to do with the electronics. I have the Garmin InReach Mini 2, and I have a subscription I pay for this, but until recently I had the subscription that I could pause occasionally. So first off, make sure your subscription is active, whether it's Garmin or a Zoleo or the Motorola one. Just make sure you've got an active subscription before your trip, and that subscription is going to carry out through your entire trip. Then you want to make sure that you have the right contacts in there. I typically have this set to send messages to my wife. I also have it going to my dad and my brother, which is a good thing, because on this next trip where I'm taking my wife with me, it wouldn't be all that helpful if I'm sending text messages to her phone when she's the one with me and I need some help. So make sure that you've got the right contacts with the correct email addresses and or correct phone numbers. And the last thing I'll do to double check this is I'll send a test message. I often do that before I leave the house, and then I'll do it at the trailhead as well. The next item on my checklist has to do with navigation, which I think is also an essential thing to be prepared for. So the main thing that I check is that I have updated the app that I'm going to use, and that I have downloaded the offline maps so that I can use it even when I don't have cell service, which is almost all the time where I go hiking. Now I use onX Hunt because I use it for hunting. This is also not sponsored by onX. I know they sponsor a lot of folks, not me. I just like the app. They have the onX Backcountry app if you're not into hunting and you don't care about those different tools. In fact, I'm sure that's probably better just for hiking. But I just use this because it's what I have and I don't want to pay for 15 different apps. It's great when I remember to download the background maps, but if I didn't do that, my main navigation tool isn't a tool at all. So if you're using your phone and if you're using an app, make sure you download those offline maps before you go. And if you're not using a digital version, make sure you have the correct map for the area you're going to at a scale that is useful, meaning you can read the trail markings, you can read the contour lines, you can make sense of the information on the map, and that you know how to use a compass for basic orienteering. You need to know how to find out where you are on a map, even when you don't know where you are. That's number one. And then you need to find out how to get from one place to another using a map and a compass. Which brings me to my last point on the checklist, which applies to these and any other electronic devices I'm going to be using. Charge your batteries. So the final step on the checklist is to make sure your batteries are charged. There's no sense in packing that extra weight around of electronic devices and batteries if they're dead and unusable. So think of things like your phone, your satellite communicator, your battery bank, your headlamp, your mini power pump if you're going to use one. Which, by the way, I did a really fun comparison of 11 different air pumps, including the very popular Flextel Zero pump. You can go watch that video if you're interested. Pretty interesting, the results. That's it, folks. That's my pre-hike checklist that I go through. Besides making sure I have all the right gear, I like to double check that all of this gear works properly so that I have no surprises once I'm on the trail. What did I miss? What else do you guys check? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to learn more from you because I'm sure I'm missing something. Then gear up and get outside.